Investigating the president. Democrats and Republicans continue to fight over the impeachment inquiry. We take a closer look at the process from a legal standpoint. Armenian Genocide. Analysis of a resolution passed earlier this week regarding the historic mass killings by the Ottoman Turks. Syrian ceasefire. New details on the agreement between Turkey and Kurdish forces. And Solemnity of All Saints. On one of the most important days on the church calendar, we learn about a newly canonized saint. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, November 1st, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. More Americans approve of the ongoing impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump than disapprove of it. That's according to a new poll released by the Associated Press, which also reveals starkly polarized opinions. White House correspondent Mark Irons breaks down the information for us. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. That poll shows 68% of Democrats strongly approve of the inquiry. Among Republicans, 67% strongly disapprove. Now investigators have summoned former National Security Advisor John Bolton to testify next week.
I haven't seen anything he's done that I think is wrong or inappropriate.
Yesterday's sweeping passage of a rules package for the House impeachment probe means Democrats are moving ahead with their inquiry. They're investigating President Trump's July 25th call in which he asked the president of Ukraine for a favor.
This entire resolution is so separated from anything that we have ever done before, any other impeachment. It's a sham.
The Founding Fathers understood that a leader might take hold of the Oval Office who would sacrifice the national security, who would fail to defend the Constitution, who would place his personal or political interests above the interests of the country. They understood that might happen. And they provided a mechanism to deal with it, and that mechanism is called impeachment.
Putting pressure on members of his party, President Trump tweets, "Now is the time for Republicans to stand together and defend the leader of their party against these smears." The president has repeatedly pointed to a transcript of the call as evidence he is innocent. The so-called MemCon is close to a verbatim transcript. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, a Ukraine expert at the National Security Council, said he tried to suggest changes to the 5-page MemCon but was unsuccessful. White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham pushed back. She says Vindman never suggested filling in any words at any point where ellipses appeared in the transcript.
President Trump announced last night he will no longer call New York his home. He has filed paperwork to move his permanent residence to his home in Palm Beach, Florida. Democrats in New York were quick to criticize. The president says the move is best for all concerned. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. And joining me now to dig a little deeper into the nuts and bolts of the impeachment inquiry is GianCarlo Canaparo, legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. GianCarlo, welcome in. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
How important do you think yesterday's House vote was?
Yesterday's House vote is a very important next step in this impeachment process, but it's very interesting to remember that not all impeachment resolutions are created the same. And this one is very unique in the history of impeachment resolutions against presidents and against other federal officials who have been impeached. This one sets out a uniquely non-transparent and unfair process between the two parties. Whereas previous impeachment resolutions have been done by the full House rather than just Speaker Pelosi. They have been done in one committee, they've been done in an open manner, and they've been done in a way where both of the parties have equal power over the procedures. But in this case, none of those things is true.
Well, give me a little bit more specifics here, because from a legal perspective, how different is this, for example, compared to former President Bill Clinton's, his whole impeachment proceedings in the 90s?
Sure, quite different. In the 90s, Bill Clinton's impeachment procedure was done before one committee only, and it was open from the start. Rather than having the Speaker of the House say, go, as Pelosi did here, you had the entire House vote on the set of procedures. Everyone was on the record right from the get-go. It was open and public from the get-go. And both the parties had the ability to jointly subpoena witnesses. In this case, only the Democrats have the power to subpoena witnesses unilaterally. If any Republican member of a committee wants to subpoena a witness, he can't do so without Democratic say-so and approval.
And that's why the Republicans have been criticizing the Democrats.
Correct.
There have been calls from President Trump and some Republicans to reveal the identity of the whistleblower whose complaint started the whole inquiry. There are some calls, whistleblower laws, to protect the identities in those, of course, like this whistleblower. Legally speaking, what is the whistleblower guaranteed?
Legally, the whistleblower really is guaranteed nothing. The way the statute works is it sets forth a set of procedures for whistleblowers to blow the whistle. And now whistleblowing is really a fundamental and important thing to do. But when you're working as a whistleblower and you're in the national security area, it's essential that you follow those procedures set forth in the statute, because what's at stake is national security concerns. In this case, we saw the whistleblower ignore the procedures, and rather than go through the Inspector General, he went straight to Adam Schiff. Having injected himself into the political arena that way, at this point, really for the sake of the public integrity of this process, he should testify before Congress. Whether he will or not is doubtful, the reason being that we saw Adam Schiff say that he doesn't need to hear from the whistleblower, which suggests that Adam Schiff won't call him, and because the Republicans have no subpoena power without Democratic say-so, it's very unlikely that he will be called to testify. But returning to the legal protections, should his name be outed, and I'm not sure that it should, quite frankly, outside of appropriate channels through Congress and through these committees. I don't think he should just be outed. But if that did happen, there's no recourse for him.
So there's no way then, once the public hearings begin, to shield him necessarily from revealing his identity, for example?
No. Again, he shouldn't just be outed by some, zealous reporter or citizen. I think that this really should go through the political process, because, again, he's put himself into the political process. But ultimately, I think whether or not he's called will depend on whether or not he gets a subpoena, and that is entirely within Democrats' control.
Okay, so there's a lot to follow, a lot to be looking at here when it comes to this impeachment inquiry. GianCarlo Canaparo, legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you for having me.
Faith-based adoption groups and foster care agencies will no longer be forced to compromise their beliefs on marriage to qualify for federal funding. The Department of Health and Human Services announced today the end of Obama-era restrictions that required the groups to place children with same-sex families. This follows a pledge to undo the restrictions by President Trump at this year's National Prayer Breakfast.
My administration is working to ensure that faith-based adoption agencies are able to help vulnerable children find their forever families while following their deeply held beliefs.
The change announced by the HHS requires adoption and foster care agencies to follow federal law, but not agency mandates. A separate HHS order moves the rescind to the Obama-era mandate that included sexual orientation as a protected class. There is time for public comment before the change goes into effect. It's likely to be challenged in court. The U.S. bishops released a statement commending the administration for this step. Kentucky State Supreme Court has ruled in favor of a Christian business owner who declined to create custom T-shirts for a same-sex pride festival. Blaine Adamson, who owns a company that makes shirts, had been accused of discrimination by a local government. His lawyers say the state Supreme Court ruling is proof Adamson can continue serving all people while declining to print messages that violate his faith. The bishop appointed by the Vatican to investigate the Diocese of Buffalo has finished his work. He interviewed around 80 people. Next, he will submit a report to the Holy See. Buffalo Bishop Richard Malone has faced widespread calls to resign following his handling of claims of sexual abuse by clergy members. Bishop Malone denies any wrongdoing and says he welcomes the Vatican's investigation. There's new developments in the ceasefire between Turkey and Kurdish forces in Syria. Turkey and Russia launched joint patrols today in the northeastern part of Syria. The exercises went without incident as they monitored roughly 6 miles of territory now controlled by Ankara. Turkey last month invaded northeastern Syria to push Kurdish fighters they consider to be terrorists out. Tens of thousands of members of a radical Islamist party in Pakistan are demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Imran Khan. They're unhappy over the state of the economy. Police and security forces were deployed today to prevent anti-government march from reaching the Islamabad's red zone, which is the Prime Minister's residence. Khan says he will not quit despite a rise in inflation and living costs. Tens of thousands of protesters also took to the streets today in Iraq. The protesters are angry over several issues, including Iran's political involvement in Baghdad. Today's rally was the largest in a series of demonstrations that began roughly 1 month ago. Around 350 people were injured. Overall, the protests have killed more than 250 people. And in Bolivia, there was more violence following the release of disputed presidential election results. Incumbent Evo Morales was declared the winner last month. He accuses the opposition leader of organizing the violent demonstrations. Coming up, analysis of a House of Representatives vote on the Armenian Genocide, and a look at a painting honoring All Saints' Day. Capitol Hill remains divided on key issues as we approach 2020, but there was at least one measure this week that passed with overwhelming support from Republicans and Democrats. The House of Representatives voted to recognize the historic mass killings of Armenians by Ottoman Turks as a genocide. The non-binding resolution passed 405 to 11. Historians estimate up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed around World War I. In 2016, Pope Francis referred to the killings as a genocide. Join us now is John Evans, the former U.S. ambassador to Armenia from 2004 to 2006, and the author of the book, Truth Held Hostage, America and the Armenian Genocide, What Then, What Now? Ambassador Evans, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
What do you make of the timing, or I should say, just your gut reaction first to what the result of the vote was?
Well, we ought to remember that this is not really the first time the United States has officially recognized the Armenian massacres as a genocide. It happened once in writing in 1951. But there has been resistance to using the word genocide ever since Turkey joined the NATO alliance in 1952. And so repeatedly, people who have wanted to say that the killings amounted to a genocide, which is the consensus of the historians and the people who study this, they've run up against a block from most administrations, Republican and Democrat. But this time, it's surprisingly, there was no signal from the State Department or the Defense Department or the White House saying you can't do this. And I think one of the reasons is because, as one of your previous segments showed, what's been happening in northeast Syria and a few other things have lifted the restraints on criticizing Turkey.
So they don't have necessarily that political pressure to have to worry about. I think
that's right. I think there's a lot of displeasure with the way the Turks have been threatening, particularly the Kurdish population in northeast Syria. The Kurds, of course, worked with us in Syria for many years.
Let me ask you about this resolution in particular. Does it say anything about the persecution of Christians, specifically when it comes to the Armenian genocide?
It does indeed, and that's one of the most interesting things about it. For years, people have talked about the Armenian genocide. The Armenians, of course, are overwhelmingly Christian. They're one of the oldest Christian nations. But this, I have a text here of the resolution, and it says genocide against Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Aramaeans, Maronites, and other Christians. Now, the main groups, along with the Armenians, were the Greeks and the Assyrians. But there were others of these smaller Christian groups who were massacred as well.
It's very interesting how it points out all of those specific groups. What, if anything, does this House passing this resolution mean for Armenians?
For diasporan Armenians, who are the product, really, of having been chased out of Turkey, it's a kind of an emotional thing. It's an emotional victory, feeling that at least the world now recognizes what their ancestors went through. For the Armenians in Armenia, it doesn't mean very much. First of all, the resolution is non-binding. So it doesn't really bind the White House or the State Department or any part of the administration.
So it's much more symbolic.
It's more symbolic. It's symbolic and it's political. It sends a message to Turkey also.
Well, as you know, Turkey's president calls the measure a slander against his country. Should the U.S. be worried about any potential negative consequences or even retaliation?
There will be retaliation. I don't think we should worry about it particularly. There have been many other countries, France, Russia, and about 30 others, I think, who have recognized the Armenian genocide as such. Usually the ambassador gets pulled back and there's some angry words spoken, but I don't think in the long run it's going to, I don't think it's going to end the NATO alliance. I don't think it's going to result in Turkey leaving the alliance. But it does send a political signal that we're watching you and be careful not to get into doing these things again.
It is a very important message, obviously a very important topic, and obviously a historic resolution. John Evans, the former U.S. ambassador to Armenia, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, what a work of art tells us about All Saints' Day. On this Solemnity of All Saints, Pope Francis reminds us of our spiritual connection to holy men and women who have come before us. In a tweet, he writes, "The memory of the saints leads us to raise our eyes to heaven, not to forget the realities of the earth, but to face them with more courage and hope." Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, joins me now to discuss a painting at the National Gallery of Art that ties into today's celebration of the Solemnity of All Saints. Jem, welcome back. Happy All Saints Day.
The same to you, Wyatt. Thank you.
We're looking at a painting from the National Gallery of Art. It's called The Baptism of Christ.
Yes, at the center of this remarkable painting, we see Jesus in the River Jordan with St. John the Baptist, who is pouring water over his head. And above them, the clouds open to reveal the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, and God the Father, who stands with his hands raised in a gesture of blessing. Below them, a weaving banner has the words in Latin, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased, listen to him." It was very common, it was not uncommon for artists to paint the scene of the baptism of Jesus. What is not so typical is to see the baptism of Jesus surrounded by saints, as we have in this scene. And so this painting is truly a unique work of art.
The details are incredible. Tell us, there are 14 saints who surround Jesus. Tell us a little bit about them.
Sure. So what we have here is a snapshot of the communion of saints. So from left to right, we would see St. Dorothy holding a basket of roses, then St. Andrew with his X-shaped cross, the symbol of his martyrdom. We see St. Christopher carrying the Christ child on his shoulder, St. Jerome with his cardinal's hat and robes, St. Catherine holding a wheel and a sword, St. Augustine dressed as a bishop, and he's holding a heart, symbol of divine love. St. Agnes holding a lamb, and St. Francis showing us his stigmata. St. Lucy with a sword through her neck, and St. Elizabeth wearing a crown. St. Anthony with his abbot's crozier, St. Apollonia with a pair of tongs and teeth, and St. Mary Magdalene with her ointment jar, and finally we have St. George in armor kneeling on a dragon.
It's incredible, like I said before, all of the detail here, and each of the saints have their own unique clothing or unique item. What was it visually about why that's so important?
That's a great question. You know, this is a visual catechesis. Paintings like this, art, sacred art, were really meant to allow the viewer to reflect on the lives of the saints through their attributes. They were reading these paintings as if they were reading the books of Scripture.
It's so fascinating. What is it, Jem, year after year, Catholics continue to celebrate All Saints' Day. Of course, it's a holy day of obligation, but still, Catholics continue to be drawn to the saints. They're still interested in the saints. What is it about the saints that continue, you think, day in, day out, in every age, that continue to attract people?
You know, St. Bernard tells us that we remember the saints to inspire in us a yearning for God. So we want to have this longing to be in the company of the saints. It has been said that the saints are God's masterpieces because they reflect God's holiness and divine beauty, the goodness of God into the world. The saints, this painting reminds us that the saints are holy because they draw close to Christ. They are, as it were, surrounding Christ at his baptism in this scene. They remind us also that we too are called, by virtue of our baptism, we too are called to that same holiness, so that one day we hope that we will be in the company of the communion of saints.
Amen to that. They are certainly great examples for each of us in our own lives. Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith and professor at the Catholic University of America. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And finally tonight, we take a look into a new saint canonized by Pope Francis last month, Sister Giuseppina Vanini, founder of the Daughters of St. Camillus. Our EWTN Rome Bureau Chief Alan Holdren tells us her story.
Giuseppina Vanini will be patroness of hospital workers and suffering people. She was born in Rome on July the 7th, 1859, the second of 3 children. From childhood, Giuseppina dealt with many sufferings, illness, and poverty. At the age of 4, she lost her father, and at the age of 7, her mother. Separated from her siblings, Giuseppina grew up in an orphanage near St. Peter's Square on the Janiculum Hill. The promoter of Giuseppina's cause for canonization, Sister Bernadette, knows the life of Blessed Vanini better than anyone else, and she tells us that the experience of living with the sisters helped Giuseppina to choose the consecrated life.
Growing up with the Sisters of Charity, on the day of her first communion, she felt the desire in her heart to become a nun herself. When she reached the age of 21, she asked the sisters to join the institute. She was admitted and then later discharged after several unfortunate circumstances. She was then sent back several times and finally discharged for good.
Blessed Vanini never gave up the desire to consecrate herself to God. She continued with the search until she met Chameleon Father Luigi Tezza. God, who permitted Giuseppina to suffer, chose her to alleviate the sufferings of others. The encounter with Father Tezza was the turning point for Mother Vanini's life. After 2 years under his spiritual guidance, on February the 2nd, 1892, Blessed Vanini consecrated herself to God. Sister Laura runs the mother house of the Chameleon Sisters community in Rome. She walks us through Blessed Vanini's room that has now been turned into a museum.
This museum collects some particular items. For example, in this luminous and open cross, we have the very first timetable of the sisters. The cross, the red cross. This cross was placed on Mother Vanini's dress by Father Luigi Tezza on the day of her profession.
Since that moment, the community grew very quickly, and today there are 800 sisters working in 22 countries across 4 continents. Her charisma is strongly present here at the Giuseppina Vanini Hospital in Rome. The head of the cardiological department, Professor Gerardo Anzalone, is proud to show the brand new intensive care unit.
And this scale intensive coronary unit is the newest and the most modern in Rome. It consists of 9 beds provided with the safest monitoring system technology, which allows to follow in real time the vital parameters for each patient in order to immediately detect life-threatening arrhythmias and cardiac arrest.
Mother Giuseppina Vanini died at the age of 51 on February the 23rd, 1911, leaving behind her example of perseverance, care, and love for the suffering. Mother Vanini was beatified by St. John Paul II on October the 16th, 1994, and was able to be canonized because of the miracle involving Brazilian construction worker Arno Klauk, who fell down an elevator shaft.
It happened in the north of Brazil, in the state of Mato Grosso. A worker fell from the 3rd floor of a building under construction, about 11 meters deep, and after the fall was not injured at all.
Mother Vanini's simplicity in daily life, faithfulness to God's call, and abundant love for those who suffer led her to the glorious throne of God.
And our thanks to Alan Holdren and our team in Rome for that story. With that, we conclude our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.